Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the man who would go on to become known to history as Pablo Escobar, was born on December 1, 1949, in the Colombian department of Antioquia, in the city of Rio Negro. Pablo was the third of 7 children born to poor farmer Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, who frequently worked as a farmhand on other people's allotments to support his big family. Pablo Escobar's mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, taught elementary school in the area, while also raising their family of 7 children. Pablo was born in Rio Negro, but his family moved to Medellin when he was still a little child. It is interesting to consider how this Colombian city came to be, and how deeply Pablo would come to identify with it. In the 1610s, the Spanish occupied the area and managed to grow a mixed-race community. Over the next 2 centuries, Medellin, located in the northwest of Colombia, in the Aburrá Valley next to the Andes Mountains, grew steadily. By 1819, it was already a regional capital when the Republic of Gran Colombia, which included modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, declared its independence from Spain. Medellin had the same economic and population growth as the rest of Latin America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The population grew rapidly as Medellin became a hub of industry, from about 60,000 in 1905 to over 300,000 at the time Pablo was born. After that, the growth continued. The city's population had grown to more than 1 million by the time Pablo reached his early 20s. As he got involved in the numerous illegal enterprises that had popped up all around Medellin, in the middle of the urban squalor that pervaded the city, Medellin became the second largest and industrial capital of the nation. Pablo joined a gang at the age of 14, risking expulsion from school. He had also participated in a number of activities with other gang members. Pablo once fought Julio Tulio Garces, and although the match ended in a loss, he didn't let it get to him. Pablo Escobar pulled a revolver on Julio Gaviria during their altercation and shot him in the foot. Escobar had never experienced violence before. This incident led to his first few nights in a Colombian prison. During his adolescence, he and his friends committed a number of small-time crimes. Some accounts claim that Escobar's early criminal activities included stealing gravestones, erasing the names, and reselling them. Others suggest he was involved in selling forged diplomas from schools and universities. It's difficult to distinguish fact from fiction when it comes to these stories about his youth. To truly understand Escobar's turbulent last years, it is important to look at Colombia's history during the 20th century and the rise of the drug trade. In modern Colombia, the drug trade and politics have a close relationship. The U.S. has long influenced Colombian politics, giving the liberal and conservative parties a stronghold. The Monroe Doctrine, which established U.S. supremacy in the region and dedicated particular focus to managing the Panama Isthmus, marked the beginning of U.S. participation in Latin America. Even though America was involved in the area, its priorities shifted when Panama broke apart from Colombia in the early 1900s. Involvement in Colombia's internal matters continued, especially with the rise of the drug cartels. Furthermore, American economic interests, aiming to dominate the trade of coffee, bananas, and other items throughout Central and South America, frequently sided with conservative politicians throughout these decades. This led to widespread poverty and a regressive economy throughout the nation. However, just before Pablo was born, the liberal faction sought to address the nation's economic problems and more fairly distribute Colombia's wealth, ushering in a period of populist governance. 1948, the year before Pablo was born, saw the assassination of populist leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, which led to a significant split between the liberals and conservatives in Colombia and laid the groundwork for the country's current political instability. After 10 years of civil war known as La Violencia, or the violence, during which more than 200,000 people died nationwide, the two parties decided to form an uneasy partnership in which they would alternately wield power within the framework of a national front. And in the years that followed, this new government started cracking down on the more left-leaning elements within Colombian politics, specifically Leninist Marxist communist groups, with the covert support and encouragement of the United States, in an effort to prevent Colombia from becoming a Russian ally in the Americas, as the island of Cuba had recently done. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, and the Colombian government engaged in a guerrilla war that started in 1964 and has continued in one form or another until the present. Other paramilitary groups that operated in rural areas of Colombia also participated in the so-called Colombian conflict. Large swaths of rural Colombia were soon effectively under the control of the FARC and other factions. All of this occurred during the 1960s and early 1970s, when global demand for illegal drugs was on the rise, particularly in the U.S. and Europe. While marijuana was once the preferred drug, cocaine, a refined and processed powder obtained from the leaves of the coca plant, became the main source of income for those who created and transported drugs into America. Colombia's climate is ideal for growing coca plants, and the country's vast rural jungles and rising levels of lawlessness in the 1960s quickly elevated it to the top spot in the world for cocaine production. While groups like the FARC did not initially directly participate in cocaine production and export, they did permit such activities to occur in the areas of Colombia under their control. They also imposed taxes on the producers, which became essential for their ability to continue their civil war against the government by purchasing cocaine. Weapons and additional supplies were provided to groups like the FARC, but eventually these groups, along with other gangs, began producing their own goods. This created a blurred distinction between Colombia's political landscape and its growing cocaine industry during the rise of Pablo Escobar. Escobar began to gain prominence in this environment during the late 1960s. By his late teens, the man who would later describe himself as a decent man who exports flowers was already entrenched in Medellin's criminal underworld. Working for Oscar Bonel Aguirre, he was involved in the sale of illegal cigarettes and car theft. Together with their associates, they amassed substantial ransom money through multiple high-profile kidnappings. But Escobar had far greater ambitions. He was eager to engage in any type of criminal activity to become wealthy quickly. He started importing marijuana in the early 1970s, but eventually shifted to cocaine. Many people came to see Pablo Escobar as a marked man. When he first met Maria Victoria Henao, she was just a teenager, and rumors suggest her mother warned her to stay away unless she was prepared to spend much of her life visiting him in prison. But Maria was undeterred. In 1976, when she was only 15 and Pablo was 26, they got married. Soon they would have 2 children, Juan and Manuela. Around the same time, in the mid-1970s, Escobar was introduced to the cocaine trade by another notorious smuggler, Griselda Blanco. Back in the 1960s, cocaine wasn't a major player in the U.S. drug scene. Other drugs like heroin, LSD, and marijuana were far more prevalent. But in the 1970s, cocaine use surged, particularly in places like Miami and New York, where the disco movement took hold. As cocaine gained popularity, the drug industry boomed across Latin America, and Colombia became its epicenter. This was the environment that allowed Escobar and other small-time operators to break into the trade. Pablo began by transporting large quantities of coca paste for well-established Medellin smugglers. The paste was processed into powdered cocaine in labs across the city and nearby regions. Escobar soon realized he could cut out the middlemen and set up his own business. He organized an extensive network to smuggle fully processed cocaine into the U.S. via multiple air routes. Little did people know that by doing this, Pablo and his associates had effectively established what would become the Medellin Cartel. But before it even took off, the cartel almost faced its end. In May 1976, while traveling to Medellin with 18 kilograms of coca paste, Escobar and a few others were arrested. Pablo's first instinct was to bribe the officials who had caught him and to manipulate the Medellin courts. When that didn't work, he tried to have the arresting officers killed to prevent them from testifying at his trial. Though the plan failed, the danger posed by prosecuting Escobar was so severe that the case was eventually dropped. This would become his signature move over the next 15 years, using extreme violence to eliminate obstacles, whether they were rivals or law enforcement. Though he often tried to paint himself as just a small-time drug dealer and believed drugs would eventually be legalized, beneath this image lay a man responsible for ordering the deaths of thousands. As cocaine use continued to rise in the U.S. during the late 1970s, Escobar and the Medellin Cartel's operation grew dramatically. They developed innovative ways to smuggle the drug into the U.S., and Escobar employed Carlos Leder, a German Colombian, and George Young, an American from Massachusetts, to help expand the business. Leder had been jailed for smuggling marijuana and selling stolen cars, while Young was importing marijuana from Mexico and distributing it across the U.S. While in prison, the two hatched a plan to get involved in the burgeoning cocaine trade. Upon their release, they began smuggling cocaine from Colombia into the U.S., primarily through Florida and Miami. Escobar initially hired them to help expand his empire, but things quickly escalated. In 1978, Leder began buying land on Norman's Cay, a small Bahamian island, intending to turn it into a crucial hub for cocaine smuggling. He forced local landowners to sell their property, even going as far as to murder those who refused. Within months, Leder had transformed the island into his personal fiefdom, spending millions on warehouses and a runway. For several years, Norman's Cay served as the Medellin Cartel's private airport in the Caribbean. Large planes arrived regularly, bringing in massive loads of cocaine, which were then transferred to smaller aircraft to be flown into the U.S. At its peak, around 300 kilograms of cocaine were being processed through Norman's Cay daily, making Escobar, Leder, and their associates extraordinarily wealthy. Leder, flush with cash, even offered to pay off Colombia's national debt in exchange for protection from prosecution. During this period, another key player emerged, Barry Seal. A pilot from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Seal had entered the drug trade in the mid-1970s by smuggling marijuana from Mexico. Like Young and Leder, he soon realized that cocaine offered far greater profits, and he switched to trafficking the more compact and valuable drug. At Hacienda Nápoles, Escobar constructed a sumptuous mansion for his family. With its sculpture park, opulent Spanish-style mansion, and assortment of exotic creatures such as ponies, zebras, hippos, antelopes, elephants, and giraffes, the estate was absolutely amazing. Escobar brought 6 hippos to the site, demonstrating his abiding love of animals. Surprisingly, their offspring are still around today. However, Hacienda Nápoles served as much more than just an exotic animal refuge. The estate's bullring, go-kart track, and large collection of expensive classic cars demonstrated Escobar's love of luxury. Even with all of these extravagant shows of riches, cartel operations never took place on the estate's runway. Escobar never carried out even more ambitious plans for the land. He envisioned building an acropolis, or palace, modeled after an old Greek palace. In addition to his opulent homes in Colombia, Escobar made large real estate investments elsewhere, demonstrating his passion for opulence to a worldwide audience. His fame had not yet peaked, so in the late 1970s, before he became notorious, he used his own identity to buy a huge pink estate on Miami Beach, Florida. But with time, this would also change. While Seal was busy dropping cocaine shipments over Louisiana, Escobar focused on expanding his empire in Colombia. Concurrently, another prominent member of the Medellin Cartel, Carlos Leder, was building Norman's Cay into his own stronghold. Meanwhile, Escobar bought around 20 square kilometers of land, about 150 miles east of Medellin, near Puerto Triunfo. The government took possession of the property when he became well known for being among the most dangerous drug lords in the world. The cartel's power had spread outside of Colombia by the early 1980s, when it started buying coca paste from producers in neighboring Bolivia and Peru. They had, in effect, created a drug trade throughout South America. The cartel was making so much money that it became logistically impossible to launder it all. To convert filthy money into clean cash, they employed a strategy that involved passing the funds through Panama, where they would purchase gold, melt it down, and then sell it overseas. Yet these strategies weren't without limitations. The cartel stashed large sums of money in covert spaces within Colombian residences. The cartel once purchased a mansion where a retractable jacuzzi concealed tens of millions of dollars. Afterwards, the cartel turned over the house to a low-class, gullible family, with the understanding that they would periodically have to leave when cartel members wanted to access the hidden funds. It's no surprise that some of this money can still be found. In 2020, Pablo's nephew, Nicolas Escobar, discovered $18 million hidden in a wall in one of Pablo's previous homes. Escobar and the cartel have frequently unintentionally discovered large quantities of money in some of their previous properties. Escobar and the other cartel members faced an increasing risk of discovery as their revenues increased. Extradition was one of Escobar and the other cartel members' biggest concerns. The Colombian government and U.S. President Jimmy Carter's administration made extradition agreements in September 1979. These agreements made it possible to extradite and prosecute Colombian drug traffickers who smuggled large amounts of cocaine into the U.S. When the agreement came into effect in March 1982, Escobar's life was suddenly at risk. If Colombia arrested and convicted him, the country's deep-rooted corruption could either allow him to avoid serious punishment or result in a lenient sentence. But if the United States had managed to extradite and prosecute him, Escobar would likely have spent the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. The possibility of extradition always plagued Escobar and the other traffickers, despite the horror they inflicted. It was always there, hanging over them like a black shadow. To protect himself from this, Escobar resorted to the populace, painstakingly constructing the persona of a man of the people, a contemporary Robin Hood. This served to heighten the mystery and fascination surrounding him. Many Colombians believed that his illegal actions were not harming them in any way. Rather, they witnessed the true harm being done to the United States, a far-off superpower that is sometimes thought to interfere too much in matters pertaining to Latin America. Pablo began donating a sizable amount of the cartel's enormous weekly revenues in an effort to improve his reputation. But this wasn't just about generosity. It was a calculated move to solidify his role as a defender of the poor, raising him to near-hero status in the eyes of many ordinary Colombians. In many cases, he gave these away to Medellin residents in the form of free cash gifts, but he also lavished significant quantities of money on construction projects in the city and around the nation. These included parks, football stadiums, and public spaces. He even temporarily waived admission fees at the Hacienda Nápoles Zoo. Enhancing the road system around Medellin was one of the biggest investments. Pablo's money played a part in alleviating the traffic congestion that had become a problem for the city due to its rapid development in the 20th century. Eventually, Escobar would dress up as Santa Claus for Christmas and distribute pricey gifts to the less affluent districts. In this manner, he gained the admiration of many Colombians in Medellin and throughout the country. Even with these attempts to change his reputation, Pablo was a marked man, widely recognized as the leader of the notorious Medellin Cartel by the early 1980s. Escobar argued that by allowing Washington to extradite and prosecute Colombian citizens on U.S. soil, President Julio César Turbay was essentially surrendering a portion of Colombia's sovereignty to the United States. Despite his populist message, Pablo faced his share of critics during his political campaign, some of whom he silenced with violence. During a debate in Medellin, one opponent openly accused Escobar of entering politics solely for personal gain. Not long after, Medellin police, some of whom were on the cartel's payroll, arrested the man. A few days later, Escobar's enforcers took control of him, and his bullet-riddled body was found on the streets of Medellin. In March 1982, Escobar secured a seat in the Colombian Chamber of Representatives by blending intimidation with populist rhetoric. His approach to politics was highly controversial. On one hand, it brought him an abundance of unwanted attention, but on the other, it acted as a smokescreen for his illegal operations and gave him a platform to challenge the extradition treaty from within the government. More importantly, his involvement in politics set off a series of actions by Colombia's conservative political establishment aimed at bringing him down. While he had once been one of many drug dealers in the country, albeit the most successful, he was now consciously working to destabilize the country's political order. Belisario Betancourt, the newly elected conservative president, was particularly determined to push Escobar out of Colombian politics. To achieve this, Betancourt launched an offensive against him in the summer of 1983. His first move was to appoint Rodrigo Lara Bonilla as Minister of Justice, with a mandate to prosecute Colombia's drug traffickers, Escobar being the main target. A long piece evaluating Pablo Escobar's previous 1976 arrest that appeared in the journal El Espectador coincided with the start of a media campaign against Escobar. This provided detailed information about what had transpired, Escobar's attempts to conceal his capture, and his strategies for avoiding punishment. New revelations came to light, exposing Pablo's affair with the famous Colombian TV personality, Virginia Vallejo, and revealing intimate details about his personal life. What began as a casual conversation between them quickly turned into a serious relationship. The affair sparked outrage both at home and in the media. Following numerous altercations and tense conversations, his wife Maria ultimately ejected him and even threatened to file for divorce. Despite all the turmoil, Pablo and Vallejo's romance lasted for a few more years before coming to an end in 1987. By the end of 1983, Escobar was drawing far more attention than he was comfortable with, which is why Medellin Superior Judge Gustavo Zuluaga chose to reopen the investigation into his 1976 arrest. In the same moment when the United States revoked Escobar's visa and the Colombian Congress lost its parliamentary immunity, Pablo knew that his scheme to use politics as a shield had completely crashed. Despite the turmoil surrounding him, he continued to contact Vallejo for several more years until their relationship came to an end in 1987. By late 1983, as Escobar was drawing far more attention than he was comfortable with, Medellin Superior Judge Gustavo Zuluaga decided to reopen the investigation into his 1976 arrest. New revelations started to surface, some exposing Pablo's affair with the famous Colombian TV personality, Virginia Vallejo, and revealing details about his personal life. Despite all the turmoil, Pablo's relationship with Vallejo continued for several more years, eventually coming to an end in 1987. In the years that followed, it became clear that Escobar was determined to use increasingly violent methods to challenge the Colombian government. He once remarked, "They ignore the suffering of the people, but are always quick to divide up official power when it suits them." Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice who had made it his mission to prosecute Escobar and Colombia's other major traffickers, was sitting in his car stuck in traffic on April 30th, 1984, 3 months after Pablo had resigned from the country's parliament. The car was traveling through Bogotá when a motorcycle pulled up alongside it. There were 2 men on the bike. Ivan Dario Guisado, riding in the back, quickly pulled out an Uzi submachine gun and opened fire on Bonilla's vehicle. The Justice Minister was killed instantly, hit by multiple bullets. The 19th of April movement, M19, a Colombian guerrilla group, executed Escobar's 1984 order to stage a coup against the government. Pablo, a former Colombian military officer, aligned with M19 in 1984 with the intent of launching an attack against the Colombian government. In 1985, the group stormed the Palace of Justice, taking nearly 300 people hostage and demanding the resignation of President Betancourt. Despite the impossibility of fully meeting the M19 fighters' demands, there appeared to be room for negotiation on the morning of November 7th, the day after the siege began. That morning, the guerrillas agreed to release a prominent hostage, State Councilor Reynaldo Arciniegas. Tensions reached a breaking point when General Jesus Armando Arias Cabrales gave the order to storm the building after lunch. Chaos erupted, resulting in nearly 100 deaths, including half of the Colombian Supreme Court judges and all the M19 fighters, leaving widespread devastation in its wake. Pablo, however, gained something unexpected from the tragedy. During the Palace of Justice attack, Colombia's top drug traffickers lost critical records and evidence. The documents, once believed to have been deliberately set on fire by M19 rebels to help avoid prosecution, are now thought to have been accidentally destroyed in an explosion during the storming of the building. In the chaos, Escobar had unexpectedly benefited from the destruction, while Betancourt's government faced severe criticism for its handling of the crisis, which resulted in the deaths of dozens, including half of Colombia's senior judges. Following the assault, Colombian politics shifted dramatically, with profound consequences for Escobar, his family, the Medellin Cartel, and drug traffickers throughout the country. The mishandling of the siege ultimately led to Betancourt's downfall, clearing the way for Virgilio Barco's victory as Colombia's 27th president in 1986. Barco's administration adopted a much more aggressive approach against Escobar and the cartels, exposing Escobar's increasingly violent tactics against the Colombian government. This incident marked the growing tension between Escobar and the authorities, highlighting the new administration's determination to take him down. In the mid to late 1980s, Escobar had several adversaries besides the Colombian government. In the late 1970s, the Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, José Londono, and Helmer Pacho Herrera, formed a rival cartel in Cali, southwest Colombia, while Pablo was supervising the growth of the Medellin Cartel. Initially, the two gangs worked together, frequently acting in their mutual best interest to avoid legal issues in Colombia and launder money overseas. They also established agreements to split up specific segments of the U.S. cocaine market. However, in the mid-1980s, tensions increased due to senior Medellin Cartel member Rodriguez Gacha's attempts to force his way into the New York City market, which Medellin had traditionally given up to Cali. By the end of 1987, widespread bombings and homicides marked a full-scale conflict between Medellin and Cali. In 1988, one of the latter even managed to blow up a vehicle bomb outside Escobar's residence. Everything made Escobar's problems in the late 1980s worse, and the Cali cartel conflict would last the rest of his life at various intensities. Thanks to the booming U.S. cocaine market, the Medellin cartel reached its peak in the mid to late 1980s, despite clashes with the Cali cartel and government efforts to imprison or extradite Pablo. By that time, the cartel was making around $70 million a day, roughly $25 billion annually, which would be nearly $70 billion in today's money. Pablo's brother, Roberto, revealed that they spent $1,000 every week just on rubber bands to bundle the massive amounts of cash they were bringing in. Since there was so much profit, up to 10% of the cartel's funds may have been lost or destroyed before they could ever be spent. At the time, the cartel was said to control around 80% of the global cocaine trade, and Pablo was considered to be among the richest billionaires in the world, but opinions on his actual wealth accumulation varied widely. Pablo persisted in using this cash to boost his standing within Colombia's borders. Escobar understood the importance of exploiting sports for his personal propaganda in particular. Starting in the early 1980s, Medellin's football team, Atlético Nacional, received substantial financial backing from him. The Colombian National League team transformed from mid-table to serious title contenders in the 1980s, thanks to foreign players and Colombia's top football talent. The team placed second in the championship in 1988 and earned a spot in the Pan-South American Football Cup, the Copa Libertadores, in 1989. Nacional advanced to the final and became the first Colombian team to win the Copa, defeating Club Olimpia of Paraguay in a penalty shootout. For Pablo, there were several advantages to investing in the club. Not only did it win him a tremendous deal of support in Medellin and throughout Colombia, but it also made it possible for him to use betting rings to launder large amounts of cash. Eventually, the football authorities clamped down on the cartel's involvement in Colombian football, shutting down even this line of business. Colombian teams faced a temporary ban from participating in the Copa Libertadores in the early 1990s. Despite the whims of the cartel's money and Atlético Nacional's athletic prowess, Escobar's drug trafficking activities were having a terrifying effect on Medellin. By the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, Medellin was statistically the most hazardous city on earth to live in, based on the number of killings and violent occurrences. For example, in 1991 alone, there were 7,237 homicides in the city, an average of around 18 killings per day, or 266 killings per 100,000 residents annually. Due to persistent hostilities with rebel groups and cartels, The population of the city increased to over 1.5 million, and Colombia became one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Colombia recorded around 25,000 violent deaths in 1991 and almost 27,000 in 1992. This amounted to around one violent death every 20 minutes, or an average of 70 deaths each day. By most traditional measures, Colombia was essentially a failed state by the late 1980s and early 1990s, partially due to the actions of Escobar and the Medellin Cartel. Pablo was not just capable of carrying out random acts of mass murder. Escobar's drug trafficking and Colombia's larger political issues were the real causes of this carnage. A number of the most well-known instances occurred in the early winter of 1989. On November 27th, Avianca Flight 203 exploded mid-flight, killing all 107 passengers and 3 others on the ground. The bombing was orchestrated by Pablo ahead of the 1990 presidential election, aiming to assassinate Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, a candidate expected to take a hardline stance against the cartels. Then, after just 2 weeks, a truck bomb went off in front of Bogotà's Administrative Department of Security building. This time, Escobar's target was General Miguel Alfredo Marquez, the department's director. The massive explosion resulted in over 2,000 injuries and 57 fatalities in the structure and its environs, with half a ton of dynamite inside the truck. In the late 1980s, despite his efforts to portray himself as a Colombian Robin Hood, Escobar was overseeing acts of indiscriminate mass murder throughout Colombia. His attempt to kill Cesar Gaviria Trujillo in November 1989 failed, as the Colombian presidential candidate was not on Avianca Flight 203. After the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, Escobar's longtime rival, Trujillo emerged as a leading contender in the 1990 presidential election. Galán, who had been leading the national polls by August 1989, was shot and killed on August 18th in Soacha, a neighborhood just outside of Bogotá. There is little doubt that Escobar ordered his murder. When Trujillo successfully ran for president in 1990, filling the void left by Galán's death, it became clear that Pablo was facing the toughest crackdown yet from the newly established Colombian government. However, in 1991, a new challenge surfaced when Colombia adopted a new constitution, which explicitly stated that it would not uphold the extradition agreement with the U.S. Many experts and observers later concluded that numerous National Assembly members were bribed by individuals connected to Escobar and the cartels, ensuring the extradition pact was left out of the new constitution. With the threat of U.S. extradition now greatly diminished and the challenges of battling both the Colombian government and the Cali cartel becoming more urgent, Pablo decided to take a completely different course of action. He started negotiating with members of Trujillo's administration about how he could volunteer to serve a short jail term to resolve his dispute with the state and, at the end of it all, become a man largely free of debt. This was an agreement that would be advantageous to both parties. While the Colombian government saw it as a chance to finally put a stop to the attacks on politicians and judges that Escobar had been in charge of for more than 10 years, Escobar saw it as a relatively clean slate within Colombia. While it may not have been the most honorable of agreements, it provided a temporary solution to a nation plagued by various issues, including a civil conflict in its rural areas, by the early 1990s. Pablo Escobar, the leader of the Medellin Cartel, willingly turned himself in to Colombian authorities in 1991. There was one catch. He had requested permission to build his own prison. La Catedral, often known as the Cathedral, was not at all what one would consider to be a standard prison. Renowned drug lord Pablo Escobar was able to negotiate terms for his release, which included building his own prison, La Catedral, atop a mountaintop with views of Medellin. Escobar was given a cozy living area with features like a football field, a jacuzzi, and a bar with a waterfall motif thanks to this layout. Escobar set up a telescope and his own private phone connection to gain an aerial view of the city below. In essence, Escobar was living in a custom-built mansion while he was under a form of voluntary house arrest. Because of this, the prison acquired the slang name Hotel Escobar, which represents the lenient nature of Pablo's actual prison sentence. La Catedral, built on a hazy hill, served as a deterrent to those seeking Escobar's escape rather than a prison for Pablo. The Colombian government promised not to pursue Escobar's extradition to the U.S. in exchange for a maximum 5-year sentence. Escobar would effectively be able to monitor his trafficking activities from the top of the hill overlooking Medellin, and the government could uphold its reputation by asserting that it had finally taken action against the drug lord. Nevertheless, the deceit was exposed quickly. By early 1992, exposés of Pablo's opulent surroundings and rumors that he was still running the Medellin Cartel from La Catedral were making the rounds in the Colombian media. In July 1992, the Colombian government gave in to pressure and attempted to transfer Escobar to a more traditional Colombian prison. However, Pablo at the Hilltop prison quickly learned of this, allowing Escobar to leave La Catedral with minimal restrictions on his journey. Constructing his own prison to contain him, Escobar devised an escape route, enabling him to depart with relative ease. He had constructed a false wall over an escape tunnel. Pablo's final dramatic incident began with his departure from La Catedral. Though he had managed to escape from a far harsher prison, Trujillo's administration was now adamantly against him, ready to call on the United States and permit American secret services to operate freely on Colombian soil in an attempt to capture, imprison, or murder Escobar. Early in the 1990s, the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command's SEAL Team 6 was operating in Colombia with the express purpose of capturing Escobar and, if possible, extraditing him to the U.S., where he would surely face a life sentence in a maximum security prison. The 1980s saw the use of bombs as well. Special troops from the United States and Colombia assisted Los Pepes following Escobar's escape from La Catedral. As soon as Escobar left the prison in July 1992, the manhunt officially began. Once Pablo had established himself at a safe house, he immediately escalated the issue by agreeing to an interview with a local radio station. He did this to mock the authorities and his detractors by detailing his escape strategy, but there was also a note of caution. Escobar agreed to return to detention under specific conditions, including completing his sentence at La Catedral. The government intensified the manhunt without proposing additional conditions, despite Escobar's intention to return to detention. Search Block, American Delta Force, and Special Operations units worked together on the streets of Medellin and Bogotá to locate Escobar's closest accomplices. When they raided the drug lord's safe house in December 1992, they came dangerously close to capturing him. Pablo's movement was slow, but progress was being made as Escobar's supporters and enablers began to abandon him, fearing he might be caught, and the cost of loyalty continued to rise. When Los Pepes murdered Pablo's brother-in-law, it was evident that things were changing. Ultimately, Escobar was able to avoid detection by the authorities for almost 9 months following his escape from La Catedral. A surveillance operation that tracked his mobile phone transmissions in the early winter of 1993 led to his eventual capture. The Barco administration established Search Block in 1986, a Colombian national police unit, and increased funding in the early 1990s as the hunt for Escobar intensified. They partnered with the Cali Cartel and Los Pepes, a vigilante organization representing victims. What happened next is not entirely clear. After exchanging gunfire, Pablo was found dead on the rooftop, having been shot in the leg, body, and ear. The gunshot that killed him entered his head through his ear, but it's suspected that Escobar fired the shot himself, since he had already decided a while ago that he would kill himself rather than risk being extradited to the U.S. Escobar and his bodyguard, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, were found in a safe house in Medellin's Los Olivos area. Their transfer was scheduled for December 2, 1993. 8 people broke through the door, and Escobar and his bodyguard fled onto the building's roof and nearby buildings. Roberto, Pablo's close friend and brother, subsequently stated that Pablo had always said he would shoot himself in the ear if trapped in this way. Whatever the truth was, the outcome remained the same. El Patron, a.k.a. the boss, was assassinated in Medellin on December 2, 1993, a day after turning 44 and almost 17 years after the Medellin Cartel had appeared. Escobar maintained the strong Robin Hood persona he had built for himself, in spite of the bloodshed he had unleashed. There were more than 25,000 attendees at his funeral. Following Escobar's demise, the Cali Cartel briefly rose to prominence as Colombia's largest producer and distributor of cocaine. The Norte del Valle Cartel, which formed in the Valle del Cauca region in Pablo's later years, posed a serious threat to the Cali Cartel. Both groups started transporting cocaine north to Mexico, the new entry point into the United States, because it was harder to navigate Caribbean routes to Florida and the East Coast. The Cali Cartel was broken up and dismantled in the mid-1990s, which gave rise to a number of new syndicates that concentrated on network building, such as the North Coast Cartel, reviving some of Pablo's previous supply routes north to American East Coast ports. Each of these groups has come and gone in its own right, to be replaced by fresher groups who are equally determined to establish themselves by ever more brutal means. Colombia is currently progressively rebuilding from the political unrest and drug cartel violence that tore the nation apart in the latter half of the 20th century and gave rise to individuals like Pablo Escobar. The Colombian government and the FARC insurgents announced a historic ceasefire agreement in 2016, which raised the prospect of ending the 50 years of paramilitary bloodshed in the nation. Additionally, Medellin has grown since Escobar's death. Following the Medellin Cartel's collapse in the mid-1990s, the city saw a sharp decline in crime rates. The city also benefited from major transportation infrastructure development and investment, which helped it regain its position as a center of business and industry in Colombia in the early 21st century. Under Escobar's leadership, the city was the epicenter of murder 30 years ago. Today, the city has gained global recognition for its innovative and eco-friendly public transportation system. Escobar's impact continues to manifest in other ways. A community of Benedictine monks took up La Catedral in 2007 after abandoning it for a considerable period in the late 1990s and early 2000s, transforming it into a place of worship with a library and other facilities. Pablo Escobar, a mysterious individual, grew up in Medellin, a deplorable urban environment that transformed from a small village to a metropolis with over 1 million inhabitants between the 1920s and the 1970s. He became a drug trafficker during a period of political unrest in Colombia, which became the world's center for cocaine production. Escobar's involvement in the Colombian drug trade is attributed to his leadership of the Medellin Cartel. He also made significant contributions to the underprivileged and disenfranchised, especially in his hometown, during a period of extreme poverty and widespread abandonment by the Bogotá government. He built jobs, provided gifts, and improved Medellin's infrastructure. He also lifted people's spirits by supporting the Atlético Nacional football team to the point where they won the Copa Libertadores in 1989. He even granted free admission to his zoo at Hacienda Nápoles. Escobar tried to develop this image of himself, like Robin Hood, but the truth is much more dire. Escobar was a mass murderer who brought unprecedented levels of violence and suffering to Colombia, specifically to Medellin. While it is true that he was not the cause of any of the nation's many problems, from the mid-1980s onward, his increasingly determined efforts to wage war on the Colombian government and its rivals, including the Cali Cartel, saw the country reach a point where over 25,000 violent deaths occurred annually, with nearly 1/3 of those deaths occurring in Medellin. Furthermore, even though Escobar was willing to give away a large portion of his wealth, the majority of which the cartel could not have used by the mid to late 1980s, he was also willing to kill hundreds or even thousands of innocent bystanders at a time in order to eliminate his enemies, as evidenced by the bombings of the Department of Security in November and December 1989 and the downing of Avianca Flight 203. Following the removal of his corrupt influence in the mid-1990s, Medellin and Colombia made slow but steady progress towards rehabilitating both the city and the nation. Escobar may have maintained that he was just a decent man who sells flowers, but the truth was quite different. How does one feel about Pablo Escobar? Was he really the merciless mass killer and opportunist that he sought to present himself as? Or was he really the Colombian equivalent of Robin Hood? Thank you very much for viewing, and please let us know in the comments area.